Hey everyone, and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. So, one thing that always interests me when we're looking at a new bit of content is what size is it? What's the area of the continent that we're going to get? Now, of course, size doesn't really matter, and if it were a video game, 1 square kilometer of Disneyland would have a lot more gameplay than, say, a square kilometer of a field. My point here is that the size of an expansion's world is just one thing. A large open field like Mulgore, that's a lot easier to make than, say, the highly handcrafted valleys of High Mountain, and what really matters is what you do in the world and the systems that support that. Warlords of Draenor was one of the largest expansions landmass-wise since Wrath, yet it felt like it had nothing because there wasn't that much to do. So, the Battle for Azeroth Alpha surfaced, and of course only the build itself, but being the crafty folk that they are, the data miners have extracted the minimap data. This is super useful because minimaps are not drawn by hand. They're generated, and they're generated to scale. Basically, the overall minimaps of a continent are split up into tiny tiles, and they're loaded in and out as you fly across the world. So, we can stitch all of these together to get a high-detailed world map that is to scale. Now, we can use this to do measurements and comparisons at a high level of detail. So, remember that the Battle for Azeroth continents, they're not finished yet. The layout is subject to change, of course. I don't expect it's going to change that much, though. So how are we doing this? Well, we're measuring it primarily in pixels. I was going to use a sort of a less accurate method of running on water with a stopwatch to measure the distance, but I came across a fantastic post that's linked below by Megasus. His method is really, really clever. You take all the minimap stuff, you bring it into Photoshop, you select the area that you want to measure, so basically just crop out the surrounding oceans and all that stuff, and then you use Photoshop's image analysis tools to find the area of your selection in pixels. This gives us a direct way to measure the size of continents, with the only variation being just how we crop around each continent. Now, my method has been to include the main landmass and then to include water whenever it was somewhere the players would regularly travel across, so kind of like connecting water between gameplay areas. So, how do the numbers show up? Well, let's start with something familiar. Kalimdor is 30.9 million pixels in area without the Cataclysm zones and 34.1 million with them. Now, Kalimdor is about a third larger than Eastern Kingdoms in terms of area, and when we move on to some other expansions, on launch, Mists of Pandaria was 10,100,000 pixels, then Warlords of Draenor was actually 14.59 million, which is quite damn massive, and it kind of makes sense when you think about zones like Frostfire Ridge and Shadowmoon Valley that had big open spaces. Now, I actually had trouble getting the Broken Isle minimaps, but the archive from the archive that I had, but Megasus found them to be just over 9 million pixels. I was getting slightly higher numbers than him, so let's just assume 9.5 million pixels with his numbers. So that'll sort of give us a rough comparison for Legion. But, you know, it's interesting. You can see their Legion is not that massive, though it's clear that they focused more on level of detail and density to kind of make up for that. So that's kind of the story up until now. So it's time for the main event. I measured Zandalar, and I found it to be 7.257 million pixels in area. I then measured Kulturas, and I found it to be 6.84 million pixels in area. This gives Battle for Azeroth a combined area of 1.401 million pixels, which makes it pretty damn close to the size of Warlords and Wrath. So we can say with a decent level of certainty here, you know what, we're actually getting a pretty damn hefty chunk of Azeroth to play around in this expansion. Now that's fine, but pixels are not they're not a relatable measurement to humans, so let's get some numbers in meters. To do this, I first had to work out how many meters 1 pixel of the minimap was. So I headed to Tanaris and I flew from the Uldum Gate to the entrance of Zul'Farrak. This took me 1 minute 45 seconds. WoW character's base run speed is 7 yards per second, and on my flying mount, my monk was going at 26.6 yards per second, so 26.6 multiplied by 105 seconds comes out to be 2,793 yards, or 2,553 meters. So Tanaris is a 2.5k long desert. So I then measured my journey on the Photoshop file. I found it to be 1,342 pixels, meaning that 1 pixel equals 1.902 meters. So using these measurements, Kalimdor is basically 19k long at its longest point. So I took these numbers over to battle, and I found Zandalar was 6.4k by 6.1k. So it's kind of square-shaped. It's got a pretty large area. Then Kulturas was 7k by 6.2k, though it's more triangular than Zandalar, which means that overall it does have a smaller area. Now, that said, you know, some of that land is water, especially in Kulturas, and both with Kulturas and Zandalar, they've got really big mountains. So who knows about the actual playable area? From what I can tell of the world, though, it does seem to stick with the theme park design language of Legion, where they focus on having more dense, tightly themed subzones, but sort of less open space. Now, as much as Wrath might be massive, you've got to remember that places like Dragonblight, Icecrown, Borean Tundra, they were a lot of just big, wide open space. Now, I actually think that this space was a good thing. I think it helped contextualize the tighter areas, I suppose, and it gave you a sense of a wider world. I just thought it was a bit more immersive. Now, I suspect that the ideal place in terms of design is a mix of both things. Now, an important thing to remember is that size and content aren't really the same thing. Legion was like 2/3 the size of Warlords of Draenor in terms of its map on launch, but it had far more gameplay because of things like Mythic Plus. Well, in Battle for Azeroth, we got Mythic Plus, we've got the island exploration scenarios as well, and hopefully they will actually feel unique due to the random generation, so just bear that in mind. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Why would I do this video? It was interesting, that's about it. It's a bit of a curiosity for myself. Figure I may as well share it. It's just kind of fun sort of whipping out the yardstick and seeing where all the expansions line up. Especially because this time it seems to actually be some, pretty good news, I suppose. So, there you go, that's a little bit of a look at the map of Battle for Azeroth, what size it is, and how it shapes up to the stuff that we have, seen in the past. If you're interested in some of the new races that are being added in this expansion, you can check out the most recent video on the channel before this one, and I also did one based on all of the new mounts that we found in the data mining, which you can check out as well. But that's it for me, thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.